I don't know. The air is full of sinister currents tonight.
Welcome to today's show. My name is John. As always, you can subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, formerly known as iTunes, or follow the links to social media in the podcast show notes. So please subscribe when you're finished listening. You can also go to classicmovierev.com to read notes, bios, and other random movie thoughts. Today's movie is The Verdict, 1946. I really don't watch too many English films unless they star Robert Donat. Having received all of my formal education in the third world country of Mississippi, I have a major problem with non-pidgin English. Anyway, I was poking around somewhere and found out that Sidney Greenstreet and Peter Lorre were in 9 or 10 movies together. Well, I've seen The Maltese Falcon 1941, Casablanca 1942, and Passage to Marseille 1944 dozens of times, so I figured I'd check out one of the others. This is how I landed on The Verdict 1946, and I was pleasantly surprised. This film is rated 7.2 on imdb.com and has a 78% liked by audiences on RottenTomatoes.com. New York Times critic Bosley Carruthers didn't care for this movie and said Lorre was disinterested and Greenstreet was puffier than usual. He must have been outside of his mind. I had no idea who the killer was until the end of this great movie. So, let's get going with the actors.
Right, and I'm a Shakespearean actor.
Sidney Greenstreet played the role of Superintendent George Edward Grodman. Greenstreet was covered in episode 100, The Maltese Falcon, 1941. Also covered in episode 100 was Peter Lorre, who played Grodman's friend, Victor Emmerich. Ian Wolfe had a small, uncredited part as a jury foreman. Wolfe was covered in episode 38, 99 River Street, 1953. Joan Loring played the slightly cockney dance hall singer Lottie Rawson. Loring was born in Hong Kong in 1926. Apparently, her mother was a Russian Jew that immigrated to the British port. The family left Hong Kong at the beginning of World War II. Good plan. Loring began working in radio in Los Angeles. At 18, she was in her first film, Song of Russia, 1944. This was followed by The Bridge of San Luis Rey, 1944. She played opposite Bette Davis in The Corn is Green, 1945, and was nominated for a Best Supporting Actor Oscar. She lost to Anne Revere, who we covered in episode 132, Fallen Angel, 1945. Loring had the chops, and she even appeared in 2 of the 10 Lorre/Greenstreet films, Three Strangers, 1946, and The Verdict, 1946. Following the war, her film career began to fade. She worked on stage, Broadway, and television. She popped back up in The Midnight Man 1974 with Burt Lancaster. The next year, she was in a TV soap before retiring. Loring died in 2014 in Sleepy Hollow, New York. What an odd place to end up. George Calaris played the ambitious inspector and then later Superintendent John R. Buckley. Calaris was born in England in 1903. He studied at London's Central School of Speech and Drama and was working in English theater by 1925. The actor moved to Broadway in 1929. His first film was Christopher Bean, 1933. Calaris met Orson Welles and joined the Mercury Theater Group. Movies that followed include Citizen Kane, 1941, For Whom the Bell Tolls, 1943, Watch on the Rhine, 1943, Blood from the Mummy's Tomb, 1971, Papillon, 1973, and Murder on the Orient Express, 1974. He returned to England and spent his later years working on stage and doing British films. He died in 1989. Holmes Herbert had a relatively small part as Sir William Dawson. He was born in England in 1882. He emigrated to America prior to World War I. 1918 found him in Hollywood, and he was very successful as a silent film actor. He switched to talking films in 1931 and found roles in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde 1931 with Frederick March, Daughter of the Dragon 1931, The Invisible Man 1933, Mark of the Vampire 1935, Captain Blood 1935, The Buccaneer 1938, and The Ghost of Frankenstein 1942. His last film was in 1952, and he died in 1956. Arthur Shields played the alibi witness, Reverend Holbrook. Shields was born in Ireland in 1896. In 1914, he began acting and directing at the Dublin Abbey Theatre. Shields was involved in the Easter Uprising of 1916 and spent some time as a POW or criminal, depending on your perspective. In 1918, he came to America and worked primarily in comedies and on Broadway until 1941. Shields returned to Ireland but was lured back by director John Ford. Shields played one of the leaders of the Easter Uprising in The Plough and the Stars 1936. He began working with Ford and others, and his film highlights include Drums Across the Mohawk 1939, How Green Was My Valley 1941, The Corn is Green 1945, The Verdict 1946, Three Strangers 1946, Fighting Father Dunn 1948, She Wore a Yellow Ribbon 1949, The Fighting O'Flynn 1949, The Barefoot Mailman 1951, The People Against O'Hara 1951, Jack and the Beanstalk 1952 as the voice of the harp, and The Quiet Man 1952. It's a lot of priest work. Shields died in 1970. Rosalind Ivan played landlady Miss Vicky Benson. Ivan was born in 1880 in England. She carried the nickname Ivan the Terrible. Her most popular films are The Corn is Green 1945, Pursuit to Algiers 1945, and two film noirs, Scarlet Street 1945 and Johnny Belinda 1948. She died in 1959. Story.
Let me explain. No, there is too much. Let me sum up.
The movie begins at Newgate Prison in London in the year 1890. As the morning bell rings, they are carrying out an execution. A melancholy Superintendent George Edward Grodman, Sidney Greenstreet, leaves the prison just prior to the execution. When asked why he's leaving early by a street policeman, he asks back, "Do you want to watch a man walk to the gallows knowing you sent him there?" The street policeman continues to compliment the superintendent on the handling of the case.
Superintendent Grodman, sir, good morning.
Good morning, Sergeant.
Are you leaving so soon? It won't be long now, sir.
Do you want to watch a man walk to the gallows knowing you'd sent him there?
He's only getting what he deserves. You proved him guilty of murder, sir.
Guilty beyond doubt.
Grodman slowly walks through the fog until he arrives at Scotland Yard. When he gets to his office, the commissioner, Sir William Dawson, Holmes Herbert, and Inspector John R. Buckley, George Caleras are waiting. Dawson says that Grodman sent an innocent man to the gallows. You can see the sheer joy on Buckley's face as he watches Grodman twist.
You sent an innocent man to the gallows this morning.
Nonsense. I suppose the usual crack brain is trying to attract attention by a false confession.
No. You've made a terrible error, Grodman.
Sir William, the man Harris was guilty of murdering Hannah Kendall beyond all doubt.
Your evidence against him was entirely circumstantial.
The executed man said that he had spent the night with a minister that left for Wales in the morning, and the rest of the case was circumstantial. Dawson brings in the priest alibier, Arthur Shields, who actually went to New South Wales, Australia, and only arrived the morning of the execution. Grodman examines the priest and realizes he has made a mistake. Grodman is forced to resign and is replaced by Buckley. Buckley won't let Grodman take the case files for review. Grodman has nightmares of his dismissal and shame. The public calls for his hanging. At Grodman's apartment, Victor Emmerich, Peter Lorre, and Arthur Kendall, Morton Lowry, the nephew of the murdered woman in the botched case, are waiting with drinks to cheer up their old friend. Kendall had testified that the hanged man was his aunt's only enemy.
Good evening, Mr. G. Good evening.
Well, Victor. Kendall, why the surprise? Someone's birthday?
No. Victor thought some wine and a little friendly conversation would take your mind off your trouble.
If I were Irish, I feel as though I were drinking at my own wake.
Grodman says he is going to write a book about the cases he has solved. Victor agrees to illustrate the case. Clive Russell, Paul Cavanaugh, comes in and is shocked to see Kendall. The two men don't like each other as Kendall is a mine owner and Russell serves in Parliament and wants to regulate mine safety. They almost come to blows, but Victor stops them. Russell leaves saying he has an early train, and Kendall says he hopes that the train wrecks before he leaves. All of the men live in boarding houses across the street from each other. Outside on the street, Russell threatens Kendall. The threat is overheard by Lottie Rawson, Joan Loring, who is Kendall's lower class fun thing. Lottie is a bit cockney. She is mad because he gave her fake jewelry. Of course, she found out when she tried to hawk the jewels.
Well, Mr. Kendall.
Lottie, what are you doing here?
Waiting for you. I called at your room as Mrs. Benson said you were in there.
I told you I couldn't meet you tonight.
Oh, you couldn't, eh? Afraid some of your fine friends might see me and disapprove.
For heaven's sake, lower your voice, Lottie.
Don't you be so high and mighty, Mr. Arthur Kendall. It was a sorry day I ever took up with the likes of you. A cheat.
Please, Lottie.
A cheat, that's what you are. I found out the jewelry you gave me, the necklace and everything is a lot of trash.
You must be mistaken.
Mistaken me I. Today I asked for the loan of £2 on your £5 necklace and all Uncle Joe would hand out was 2 shillings. And it's the same with all the rest. Uncle Joe says it's a lot of rubbish.
If it is false, it's no more than appropriate.
Very well, Mr. Arthur Kendall. But before we part, I'll thank you to return the genuine and expensive watch fob which I gave you.
She asks for the expensive watch fob she gave him, but he storms away. Grodman and Victor watch this last part. Lottie threatens to have Kendall killed.
Sorry we can't continue our evening. Perhaps another time. I don't know, the air is full of sinister currents tonight.
Kendall goes to see landlady Miss Vicky Benson, Rosalind Ivan, who is, of course, drinking alone. He asks for a wake-up at 6 a.m. Kendall goes to his room and securely locks the door and windows before retiring. He doesn't answer when landlady Benson knocks at 6 a.m. She rushes across the street and wakes Grodman, who is already dressed. When he gets no answer, Grodman breaks the door and finds the murdered Kendall. Landlady Benson screams, bringing a bobby, who finds Victor standing outside of Grodman's apartment. The second scream leads them to the murder. Grodman sends for Superintendent Buckley. Buckley questions everyone, and the locked door is a real puzzle. Later, Buckley and Dawson go over how the room was locked, and they have no idea how the murderer got out. Buckley calls in a professional burglar to show how the room could have been broken into, or out of. The burglar is no help. Finally, Buckley goes to see Grodman. Buckley starts grilling Victor. Victor tells about Lottie. That night, Lottie leaves the theater in the fog, looking like a perfect Ripper victim. She goes to Kendall's room and tries to find the watch fob. Buckley comes in after her and starts quizzing her about the murder. Buckley says there was no watch fob in the room. Landlady Benson shows up outside the door, and the two ladies start to scrap. Buckley arrests Lottie. 2 days later, Grodman comes to see Buckley at Scotland Yard. Buckley thinks the fob is with the murderer, and Grodman says it may have been buried with Kendall. The mortician can't remember the fob, so they have the body dug up. Victor shows up and says he always wanted to see a grave opened, especially at night.
Good evening, Superintendent Buckley. Good evening. Lovely night, isn't it?
I can think of nicer ones. Why have you come here?
Well, I've always had a suppressed desire to see a grave open, especially at night. It's exciting.
You seem to have greater interest in Kendall dead than alive.
Landlady Benson shows up and demands that they do not desecrate Kendall's grave. In the breast pocket of the dead man is a picture of Landlady Benson with a lover's inscription on it. The fob was also there. Lottie is eventually released. Victor and Grodman go to see Lottie singing and dancing at her club. Buckley is at the club also. After her act, Lottie joins Victor and Grodman. They have a good time drinking, and Victor draws Lottie's picture on the tablecloth a la Toulouse-Lautrec.
I liked him a lot, I did.
I know.
I like you too, Victor. Vicky.
I like you too, Lottie.
And I like you, Mr. Grodman.
Thank you, my dear, but nobody really likes a policeman.
I like you. You're the nicest policeman of them all.
Lottie eventually says no one looked into Russell as a suspect. She says he threatened Kendall and had a side girlfriend. Russell returns to the boarding house and he finds his door open. He checks the bureau, then calls Landlady Benson. She informs him that Buckley was in the house. He goes across the street to Grodman's place. Victor is there and jumps in the closet as Russell comes in. Grodman shows up later. The two men, thinking they are alone, begin to talk about the murder. Buckley has found out that Russell did not arrive at his destination for 3 days. Russell says he has to protect a lady. Finally, Russell says he is having an affair with Lady Pendleton. Grodman and Russell leave to get a drink. Victor comes out of Scotland Yard after being questioned by Buckley. Grodman is outside. Victor says Buckley plans to question Lottie about Lady Pendleton. While Lottie is in her dressing room, someone throws some lilies and a note warning her not to talk about Pendleton. Lilies are the flower most associated with death. Buckley arrives shortly, and Lottie admits Kendall was blackmailing Russell. Lottie also says she is more of an orchid than a lily person. When the police leave, Victor appears out of the shadows to see Lottie. Victor brings her orchids and a bracelet.
Am I disturbing you?
No, I'll be ready in a jiffy.
Please take your time. There's no hurry at all. You know, I saw that Buckley outside. What does he want from you now?
The policeman? Oh, he consults me on all his cases.
He does?
Mm-hmm. Did you bring me something, Vicky?
Oh, just these.
Orchids.
I thought they might suit you very well.
I always feel among the flowers to see if there's a surprise. Oh, Vicky, it's beautiful.
Well, I'm happy you like it.
Vicky.
Yes?
Come here. Look me up.
I will.
Victor comes home, and landlady Benson is very nervous. Victor creeps her out with talk of throat cutting.
You lock yourself in your room, sir.
I will.
You ought to have a police whistle, too, just in case.
Yes, I should. But how would you blow a whistle if somebody cuts your throat?
That's right, I never thought of that.
See?
No wind.
No.
Victor goes to his room and removes a revolver from his pocket. A gloved hand opens the boarding house door and a shadowy figure goes up the stairs. The person tries to enter Victor's room, and Victor opens fire, chasing the figure away. Landlady Benson is about to die of fright. Victor searches the house while Landlady Benson calls for help. After a bobby comes, she beats on the window and wakes Grodman. As Grodman dresses, 2 black gloves fall out of his night clothes. Buckley shows up at the boarding house and scares everyone again. Buckley begins to lead everyone to Kendall's room. Russell shows up just in time for the demo. Buckley says the killer was well known to Kendall and was freely admitted. After the murder, the killer broke the bolt. He would then use thin pliers to lock the door from the outside. Since the door had to be broken down, they would assume that they broke the bolt at the same time. Buckley says he found a knife, a train ticket, and a receipt in Russell's room, and that he is the murderer. Buckley arrests Russell. Next, the jury is shown debating the guilt of Russell. The jury holdout believes it's a setup because he didn't get rid of the evidence against him. Finally, the jury finds Russell guilty. He is condemned to be hanged. Sometime later, Grodman comes to tell Russell that his appeal was denied and he will be hanged in 3 weeks. Grodman wants to contact Lady Pendleton to give him an alibi. Grodman begins his 3-week search for the woman who is somewhere in France. Grodman makes it back to the prison just hours before the execution. He has to give Russell the news that Lady Pendleton is dead. Victor is drinking himself stupid prior to the execution.
Pardon me, sir, but don't you think you've had enough?
Yes, I've had enough, but sometimes enough is not enough. How can I have enough if I know that dawn means death for somebody?
I don't know, sir.
See? Nobody knows.
Victor goes to see Grodman, and Grodman is writing a note about how much Victor knows about the murder. They talk about the last chapter of the book.
You know the end? The last chapter?
Yes. Don't you?
I want a drink.
He took advantage of my friendship, Victor. No one will ever do that again.
Grodman reveals that he found a button off Victor's coat from when he was hiding in the closet. Grodman says he found out that Kendall killed his aunt. He says Kendall used his friendship with Grodman to frame the first hanged man. Grodman says he must tell who murdered Kendall to save Russell. Victor says he is very afraid and asks if they really have to go to the prison to tell the truth. Grodman finishes his book on the way. He says he gave false clues as revenge against Buckley. Victor and Grodman go into Buckley's office. Grodman asks Buckley if he takes responsibility for the execution. Finally, he says Russell is not guilty. Grodman explains that he drugged Kendall, and after they broke into the room, when landlady Benson was outside of the room, he stabbed him.
Russell is not guilty. I'll tell you how Kendall was killed. He was still alive when Mrs. Benson knocked on his door. But he had something in his last drink the night before. Something to make him sleep on, heedless of her knocking. When Mrs. Benson came to my window, I was not asleep, although I pretended to have been. Buckley jumped to the obvious conclusion that the murderer killed Kendall, and then magically got out of the locked room. Actually, he was murdered after the door had been broken. Mrs. Benson is an impressionable woman. She thought she saw more than there actually was to see. During the short time I was left alone with the unconscious Kendall, I killed him.
Kendall murdered his aunt and allowed an innocent man to die. Grodman said he could avenge the murders and make a fool out of Buckley. He only had to reveal his crime because Lady Pendleton died. He gives the book to Victor and says it was he who tried to break into Victor's room. Ooh, that's a big target to miss. World famous short summary: revenge, like Romulan ale, is best served cold. I hope you enjoyed today's show. I really appreciate you spending the time listening. You can find connections to social media and email on my site at classicmovierev.com. There are links in the podcast show notes as well. Remember, the show is completely free and independent. All I ask is that you jump over to Apple Podcast and give me a review. It really helps the show get found. Beware the Moors.